All right, we are sitting here with Skip Heitzig, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Albuquerque. You, of course, hold a special place in our hearts here in Tucson.
Likewise, Tucson holds a special place in my heart.
Oh, well, thank you for Robert.
Thank you. You're welcome.
So that's awesome. So I feel like you don't have to tell a whole room full of evangelical Christians why the Jews are special and why we should love them, because we already do. But evangelizing to the Jewish people. We love them so much, we want them to know Jesus. We know that in the end, they will come to know the Messiah. But how do you broach introducing the gospel to a devout Jew today?
Okay, let me back up a little bit on that question, because I think there is a misconception, because you mentioned that you don't need to tell a room full of Bible-believing evangelicals to support Israel or the Jew. Actually, more and more, we're seeing younger evangelical pastors not have the same stand toward Israel or support for the Jewish nation like their forebears did. So we are seeing sort of a movement like, who cares about Israel? There's no special deal about the Jewish people. There's no love for Israel. There's no tours to Israel. They have kind of bought into the whole one side of the Palestinian conflict that sees them as occupiers. And that's a very popular narrative. So I find that it's sort of the chic in theology now to ditch Israel and to be pro the other side without hearing the whole story. So that's one part of it. When it comes to dealing with Jewish people, I find that just being interested in a Jewish person and Judaism and Israel is a conversation starter. And just say, like I will say, gosh, I love Israel. I've been to Israel. I've been on tours to Israel. Oh, you have? That automatically opens the door. And then, well, why do you love Israel? That's always the question. Why do you love Israel? Are you Jewish? I said, no, but I love the Jewish God and I believe in the Jewish Messiah. And then I'll say, look, in all fairness, I'm a Christian. This is what I believe. But I also believe that Jesus was not a Gentile. He was not a Christian. He was Jewish. And that he kept the law. And so that interests them. They have at least a passing interest in the fact that we believe in the Jewish roots of Christianity. And then I gauge to see what level of interest they have going beyond that in a conversation. Some have an interest to really go deep. A lot of people want to brush it off. And then I'll ask them, well, so what kind of a Jew? Are you Orthodox? Are you Reform? I'll kind of go through the different practices and brands. And I find most of them will say they're Reformed. So I know that their belief system isn't deep, their rootedness to Israel probably isn't as deep as mine is to Israel. And I know immediately, I know more about Judaism than they do, unless they're Orthodox. And or if they are Orthodox, I'll try a little Hebrew on them. I'll say a few words in Hebrew and see if they know a little bit of Hebrew. So if they know that we're interested and we love them, they'll open up. If they feel like we have sort of a canned message to give at them, not so much. They'll walk away from it because listen, there's been a lot of bad blood between the Christian church and Judaism, going all the way back to the Crusades. And a lot of Jews to this day will fault Nazi Germany and the Crusades as Christian movements against Judaism. So you have to overcome some of that.
The movement you were talking about earlier, where people not so much supporting Israel and the Jews, does that play into the whole replacement theology and that just growing and growing among a younger generation?
That's part of it. That's part of a Reformed theology, an amillennial theology. And so there is just not the place, or Israel is it's a stone of division for people. Even God said, I'll make Israel a cup of stumbling. It's already that. It's already become that. And it's the Reformed theology doesn't see a unique place of Israel. See, the evangelical will say, look, we know the difference, and we know that God has a plan for the church and for Israel. And sometimes they overlap, and sometimes they're distinct. But he does have a plan for them, and we recognize that the chosen people isn't the evangelical Christian. Or God's elect isn't always the evangelical born-again believer. It sometimes is the Jewish nation that he has a plan of restoring. So the prophet Ezekiel said that Israel would be gathered in the land, but also he made a promise that there would be a spiritual restoration. We've seen the regathering. We haven't yet seen that spiritual, there's traces of it. There is revival breaking out. There are more Jewish Christian believers in Israel today than ever before, numbering in the tens of thousands. There was, I met the man who was the very first evangelical pastor in Israel in 1948. And he had 3 or 4 people in the country that were believers. Now there's 30, 40,000.
Wow. You talked a little bit about the America-Israeli relationship, and I don't want to get political, but I do want to ask you this one question. If America continues, and I pray to God that we don't, but on this pathetic political path that we're on right now, do you see us walking away from supporting Israel? And
yeah, well, fortunately we have some pretty strong ties with Israel historically, even politically, so that, fortunately presidents usually are short term in our country. In most countries they last a lot longer than 4 years or 8 years, they last 50 years. In some cases a lifetime. So that's why usually you have world leaders in other countries. We play checkers, they play chess. They think of the long game and who's in the White House first, but fortunately the policies forged from our country with Israel are so strong that they're one of our strongest allies in the world, and that's part of our policy, that's American policy. That hasn't changed. But you do get presidents like you had President Obama and you have President Biden that aren't as warm to Israel. I met Netanyahu in his office when Obama was the president, and the relations were not good. It was a very cold relationship. That changed when Trump got in office, and Netanyahu and Trump were like best buddies on an outing. And now it's sort of reverted back. Of course, there's a new prime minister and a new president. And that happens to be a political platform that does not want to overtly talk about our relationship of goodwill toward the Jewish nation. Partly because of what goes on in Congress with the squad and what these gals are doing to upset that relationship. And you have a president who's trying to, you didn't want to get political, and here I am getting really political on you, but you have a president who's trying to really appease the progressive arm of the Democratic Party. So I don't think that that's in imminent danger now of collapsing, the ties that we have with Israel. Of course that could change because we don't know what the future holds, but at some point the world is going to realize, there's one impediment to peace, and it's those Jewish people. Because whether you agree or not, there's all these countries around them that hate them. And so why are we supporting this one underdog? Something is going to tip toward that direction, according to Zechariah. But I don't know what that is.
I've asked a couple of the other speakers this, and I just want to get your take on it, Skip. I know this was not your topic specifically, but what's happening right now in Russia and Ukraine. We see the heartbreaking video of what's happening to the people in Ukraine, yet part of us gets excited, and maybe we jump too quickly. What does this mean? What does this mean?
Right.
Last day, is this just another in a long series of birth pains, or can we look at this and say, okay, this could be something very big starting? No, Russia is not attacking Israel, but are they next? Is this coalition going to come together now? How significant is what's going on in the Ukraine?
I think it's significant, my opinion. And I won't jump the gun. I don't want to jump the gun, but I do think it's significant. And you mentioned birth pains because that's the word that is used for that in the New Testament. Jesus at the beginning of sorrows or birth pains. Think about a birth pain, and you're a woman. You'll be able to tell me more than anyone. But I remember it's not just frequency and intensity, but a birth pain. There's a contraction, and then a release. Right? That's what the contraction is. The muscles contract and get really tight, but then there's a release, a sense of calm. So I think the birth pains that will happen more frequently and more intensely have with them an event that happens, but then a relaxation, almost a time of peace. So we have seen sort of a relative peace, and now it would look like another contraction. I think COVID, maybe, I don't know how that plays into it. Certainly the thing with Russia and Ukraine. What's interesting about that is that the war of Gog and Magog, that's always the question of the hour. Whatever this is, I can certainly say we are, the prophecy of Ezekiel was written 2,600 years ago. We are certainly in a window of time that could not have been fulfilled up to this point, because there never has been historically a coalition between Magog, Rosh, Tubal, which is Tobolsk, Russia, and the areas above the Black and Caspian Sea. Russia, what we call Russia today, there's never been a coalition of them and Iran, Persia, it says in that text, Togarmah, Turkey, but now there is. Now you have Erdogan, who's bought a defense system from Russia. You have Iranians who have 1,000 Russian nuclear scientists living in Iran developing for them right now and buying weapons from them. So there is now a semblance of a coalition, which means since that was prophesied but has never, we didn't see that ever in history like we see it today. So is this the Gog of War and Magog? Maybe, maybe not. You know, the question theologically is, does that war take place before or after the tribulation? And there's a division on what that is. I tend to think it will happen before the tribulation. I think there's a good chance it's pre-tribulational war that causes an event that might even precipitate toward the rapture. You know, we have to take a wait and see approach. But I do, to answer your question, I do think it's very significant because we're in a window of time prophetically that we just haven't seen up till now.
For people who are watching this and they want to hear more about prophecy, they want to hear more about you talk about Revelation, you just wrote a book on it, where can they go direct people?
If they want to get the book, anywhere books are sold, Amazon, anywhere you buy books, you can find the book I wrote, You Can Understand the Book of Revelation. We have a website at our church, in Calvary Church in Albuquerque, that has 40 years of teaching free of charge. You can download anytime you want, specifically on prophecy. We did a series through the book of Revelation. It took me about 1.5 years to go through, so it's pretty in-depth. But it's all in the book. If you want to just cut the corner and just get the book and have a reference, that's probably a good source to get.
Thank you.
You're
very
welcome.
much,
Thank
Skip.
you.